Oh, thank you. It's a delight to talk to the group today because generally we talk to uh, people who are maybe less inclined to hear what we're talking about. But it's a pleasure to hear your overview, Frank, and I think that's exactly what we found to be important. So what we're going to do is do a fairly quick walkthrough here of our study. As you can see, the title is pretty impressive, actually. We read it, Democratizing Computation Data to Bridge Digital Divides and Increase Science for Underrepresented Communities. And we had a team that worked together. You see the list there. Today, 3 of us are going to talk to you, myself, Lauren, and Joel. And we did a series of interviews over the summer and actually presented a report to NSF in October. So let's go to the next slide. Yeah, so the issue is this. As you know, NSF has supported high performance computing for a long time, starting in the 1980s, actually, with some of the supercomputing centers. They've done a lot providing expertise, capabilities, and growing the program. And I think OSG is a terrific example of how that's migrated and changed and grown. But even that being said, to pick up on your point, Frank, you look at it, there's still millions of students, staff, students, citizens who are not involved. And the question is, what's going on? Why is that? As you said, let's look at it's an order of magnitude issue here. After 30 years, what can we do to move that needle substantially? So that's really what our study looked at, is how do we begin to address this issue? So with that, Lauren, next slide.
So the goal of this study, and really the process that we went through, was to put together several focus groups and ask the participants with several expanded questions, but basically around the idea of how can NSF significantly expand, diversify, and support the development of new cohorts and communities of scientists and researchers to address pressing research, social, and global issues in 2030. And we did so with focus groups focusing on investments in cyber infrastructure, things relevant to research, computing, data, software, and all of the other services and technologies that support researchers' use of these. And while the focus of the study was on these computing and data capabilities, there are really much broader implications to this bigger question for NSF regarding the missing millions. And even though cyber infrastructure investments certainly have their own issues of representation and ensuring diversity in the individuals who use and support cyber infrastructure, we also recognized, and our focus groups did too, the important role of cyber infrastructure in addressing representation across STEM by bringing research through computation and data to the fingertips of even more could-be researchers and making STEM careers more accessible to them. And we recognized also and heard in our focus groups that there's an urgency in addressing these matters, given not just the pandemic, but other recent acknowledgement of social disparities and societal divides, and that the gaps are widening rather than narrowing. Next slide.
So when we had the focus groups, we asked people looking ahead, what is their vision of success for reaching the missing millions? And there were a series of thoughts that were identified by folks, 11 themes. I'll just mention 6 of them, which are highlighted, that essentially people said, first of all, in the NSF language, this involves achieving broader impacts. And what they really talked about was, we love the phrase, ubiquitous access to high performance computing and cyber infrastructure. Importantly, people talked about what we might call innovation at the edge, whether it's Jupyter notebooks or various forms of distributed or edge computing was a part of that access. Of course, it also involved data leadership in any number of ways. And importantly, both for the CI professionals and for students and faculty working with cyber infrastructure, either as the work they do or the research they do, career paths were still taking shape and needed attention, bringing together HR professionals to understand how to form professions around this work. And finally, and it's an important theme, we learned that, of course, the phrase minority serving institutions, MSI, is actually not the overarching phrase. It's HBCUs, it's TCUs, it's HSIs, as well as other minority serving institutions. People feel their identities need to be each expressed uniquely, and they all need deeper expertise. There's more that could be said, but those are just some elements of the vision of success motivating the report that we did. Alan?
Yeah, so we looked at, came up with several findings, and the first one is fairly obvious to almost everyone. They said, there's barriers to access, and we've heard that over and over. And it's not just access to computing, it's networking, it's data, it's a whole range of things. So that's a huge issue. But the problem is it's not that simple. We often think just give somebody access and they're there. It's like giving your kid the keys to the car and say, go ahead and drive, but you can't leave the garage. I mean, it's just, you have to provide really, which is the second one, which is talking about how do you provide ability and capability of people to take advantage of these resources. And that's a large part of it. Without you need access, it's essential, but without having the ability to use it, it's not quite worthless, but you haven't gotten there. So that was a loud, clear message we heard. And clearly, we start looking at the underrepresented sides of the citizens and so forth in our communities. There are huge gaps there. And so this said we need to begin to look at that in a more effective way. How do we study it? How do we socialize this? Because it really is a community issue. It's not just education. In fact, one of the gripes I have about barriers is we often think of simply providing information is enough. It's not enough. You have to figure out how people can take advantage of and use it. And as we already heard, there's insufficient engagement at underrepresented institutions. Look across the board, and it's pretty dire, and we've got to find a way to get at that stage as well. The last point here on this slide is it's not just about computation. I think this is what's really important. It's about software, it's about data, it's about communities. It's really an ecosystem approach. So it's not just we just do this and we're there. We got to do a bunch of stuff together. So next slide.
And among our 10 findings, we have another 5 here. And you'll notice on these slides, we're also showing quotes. The report shows quotes from our focus group participants, anonymized, of course, that sort of resonate with these. But in addition to what Alan just mentioned, there was a recognition not just of needing to engage a diverse set of institutions and the individuals they serve, but that there are fields and disciplines that have been underengaged by cyber infrastructure investments, and also that the requirements they have, the needs for computing, data, software differ from where some of our most significant investments have been made in the past. There was a recognition, though, that recent investments in the human resources, the human infrastructure and cyber infrastructure has really been paying off around ideas like research computing and data facilitation. And there are opportunities to expand those investments further and to bring the benefits of those investments to a greater number of individuals and institutions. We also heard that investments in distributed and edge computing are one way to reach more diverse communities and institutions in particular. As Frank mentioned, right, being able to reach some of these institutions that have barriers simply by way of lack of access to internet connectivity, and developing distributed infrastructures that allow edge computing and endpoint integration are sort of one way to bring those sorts of communities into play. There was also, especially because we talked quite a bit to researchers, a spirit of really encouraging the NSF and other entities to be experimental and science-based in pursuing some of these new avenues and evaluating them, and recognizing that a certain amount of trial and error and failure would be part of that process, but that overall, broad systemic change is needed, not just in any one directorate or funding source, but by leveraging collaboration and cooperation across organizational levels, including funding sources.
And we basically came up with 12 pathways and recommendations, and we'll talk about a few of them here. And I'll take the first one here, which is looking at ensuring inclusive access. Back to my comment about access and ability to use it is important. But also we need to look at issues of, as Laura just said, how do we link in the community? How do we begin to provide not only information, but ability to use this? One of the things that was clear is that because we limit our scope on what we consider to be primary science, we end up not degrading, but not accepting the value of other science being done in other ways. And so how do we encourage that? So this inclusiveness is important because the complexity of much of the science being done today extends across the entire social spectrum as well. We tend, by not doing that, we're limiting the ability to provide the answers and directions we need as a community.
And I'll take the second one, which is highlighted. We really had people say, what if and why not? What if, for example, the NSF were to designate a broader impacts seat on review panels? What if IRBs were trained to not be overly restrictive, but to be supportive of community ownership of data in the communities that surround institutions of higher education? And there were a number of other of these what ifs that panels raised, and it led us to the recommendation that rather than just making a policy change with the NSF should experiment and deliberately adjust review processes, adjust the approach that it takes. And frankly, the NSF has done experiments like this in the past. We felt that they should be in a continuous cycle of learning and adjustment to accomplish greater equity and inclusion. Lauren?
Yeah, and expanding on point made in the findings that it's not just about computing, but also data and software. We heard from the full range of focus group participants, including researchers who really haven't taken advantage of some of the most significant cyber infrastructure investments, that they acknowledge and appreciate the investments in computing, but acknowledge significant gaps remaining for services and standards relevant to data and software that promote accessibility, reproducibility, interoperability, and sustainability. Things like generalizable data environments, curated data sets that are available sort of nationally and internationally that otherwise are very difficult to find, even though the researchers who've put them together try to make them accessible, they're not integrated well with environments for working with that data and bringing that data to an expanded STEM workforce. And similarly in software, there are examples across NSF directorates, for example, where there are multiple softwares that do a lot of the same things. And there could be investments in identifying and bringing together some of the strengths of redundant software so that there are standards that are much easier for researchers to navigate and begin engaging with.
And in the interest of time, we're not going to go on all of our recommendations, but they're all fair game for questions. But Alan, let's go through the last three that we've highlighted.
Right. So if you look at number 8, we're talking about accelerating broader impacts. And one of the things we heard from the community is we need to do more of that. And that goes a couple directions. One of the things that was recommended is we looked at those projects and programs that had great broader impact. Can we learn from them? Are there best practices? Are there other ways to do what we've been looking at? But I think the biggest thing we heard is, although NSF says you have to have broader impact along with innovation and that, intellectual merit, what if it's broader impact began to be more seriously taken, thought about and proposed? So instead of just being a couple of lines in a proposal, what if it had the same methodological rigor we expect for the innovation side, where innovation and broader impact become really important? Again, the emphasis here, it's already been done, but is there a way to accelerate that sort of activity? So Lauren?
Yeah, we also heard some specific recommendations, kind of orthogonal to some of the others, that what is done in this space, given that it needs to be systemic, has to take into account sustainability. And we often think of financial sustainability when we talk about investments in cyber infrastructure, but there was an acknowledgement of a need for, in particular, social sustainability of community building efforts, and also a growing interest in environmental sustainability, such that investments in cyber infrastructure should be evaluated not just in terms of impact per financial cost, but also impact per environmental costs and societal costs of other types.
And the last thing that we'll highlight is that OSG itself is a multi-stakeholder consortia, and we had representatives from quite a few consortia in our focus groups. In my own research, between 1950 and 2000, we've identified about 24 multi-stakeholder consortia in data and open science and computing. In the last 20 years, it's been a tenfold increase. Over 100 such consortia have been formed. And we argued in the report that these consortia represent an important part of the institutional landscape for reaching the broader the missing millions. And so we encourage NSF to build better capabilities to launch and sustain consortia in this space. So with that, our goal was to summarize key findings from the report in just about 20 minutes. And we'd really like to open it up for questions or comments, and delighted to share anything more that's of interest to you in this study on reaching the missing millions.
Thank you. Any questions from the audience? So we got this sorted where the link is. That's also so that's in the chat. Any other questions, comments from anybody?
Well, while people are thinking about Frank, let me just say one of the things that was delightful in this study is we found such, I mean, we all learned something, number one. The level of interest was absolutely, I think, overwhelming, saying, people were generally and genuinely interested in seeing something like this happen. And so I think there's a there, and I would figure out how to leverage it to go beyond that. But it was an interesting experience. I mean, and I'd let Joel and Lauren respond in addition, but it was we got unqualified support and many different ideas.
Lauren?
I was going to echo. I have felt very privileged to be a part of this, partially because it's opened my eyes to areas of cyber infrastructure and aspects of representation, reproducibility, how to reach audiences that in particular I am less familiar with. We had focus group participants who've worked with high schoolers and developing programs and communities that encourage interest in STEM among high school students and undergraduates. It was a really lovely mix, and each focus group was a lovely mix of different perspectives, where I think not only was there, as Alan mentioned, already some momentum amongst those who showed up and interest and commitment to helping solve the problem, but that commitment grew. And we heard from quite a few focus groups that they really wanted to be looped into subsequent efforts around the project.
Yeah, I would say, and in fact, invite the OSG community to be part of this growing community of practice committed to broader inclusion. We were reminded by the tribal colleges that they deal with what is essentially sovereign data. We heard from folks working with Flint with their water data that they still don't have good quality data to understand what is and isn't safe. And there are dozens of other Flints around the country. And so there was a real sense in which it was broader aspect inclusion of the missing millions, not just as an end in itself, important as that is, but so that research and analysis and projects could reflect the interest of the diverse communities that are involved. So people in a post-industrial digital age saw cyber infrastructure, as Alan was sort of saying, as the keys to the car.
One of the things that I would encourage people to do is look at the report, look at the quotes, because the quotes are really kind of unvarnished. But they give you a good flavor of what was being said. And one of my favorite quotes was, don't teach me how to fish. I don't know what fishing is. It's more basic than that sort of thing. But let me stop there and I'll turn back to Frank to see if there's other questions or comments.
So there's Ken had a question, and then Eva. So let's start with Ken. Ken Bloom. Can somebody?
Okay,
there we go.
I had to be given permission to unmute, so thanks. So first of all, I mean, super topic, and certainly really great for an open science grid meeting, right? Where certainly the whole goal of open science grid, right, is to get computing resources into people's hands and help them use it, and to help make us aware of all the people we might be missing in this respect is a really good reminder. I mean, something that comes to mind, and I haven't read the report by any means. I mean, are you pushing, shall we say, on the supply side also, right? That, I mean, to, if we want to broaden access, which is a great goal, right? We need to also broaden, we also need to provide things for people to have access to, right? I mean, we should, we need to make sure that we have the computing resources and the software resources and the facilitation resources to put in those people's hands, right? I mean, we don't, so much of the narrative around public resources is around scarcity, right? And we're going to have to address the scarcity of resources also to enable all this the broadened usage too. Is that discussed in the report or on the radar screen?
So I know Alan and Lauren will both have things to say about this, but one thing that I'd like to share on that is the NSF is leaning in, not just on our report, because this is the phrase missing millions has been on the agenda in the NSF for some time. And I've been involved in helping to facilitate the launch of what's called the Minority Serving Cyber Infrastructure Consortium, a group of HBCUs, tribal colleges, and Hispanic serving institutions. And the NSF has provided them both funds as a consortium and campus by campus support for building out the cyber infrastructure in just the ways that you're saying. Having science DMZs and other capabilities. But one of the key lessons, and it's a challenge, is that each campus can only do so much by itself. Cybersecurity is a good example where not every campus can have the full access to the depth of expertise that's needed. But together they can accomplish what they can't do separately. So people are exploring cyber infrastructure investments for shared positions and shared resources. Internet 2 has leaned in and formed a partnership with MSCC. And so there's a lot of folks that are seeing exactly what you're saying, which is that we have to build out the capability so that people can be part of the conversation.
Let me just add one other quick comment here, and that is, yeah, we didn't say that wasn't important. It is, you're absolutely right, it's essential. But the thing is, it's also happening is you're seeing more computing closer to the edge. We're seeing new devices, and we really haven't found a way to leverage that capability well either. I mean, for example, we heard from some comments, why do I have to learn program languages? Why can't I just do X? If we began to think about the problems in different directions, there's a lot of compute power out there. The power of some of the laptops and even the mobile units are getting incredible now. And so there's another whole capability there, not to detract from what you were saying, Ken. We need the overall pie needs to grow as well. Lauren?
Yeah, another facet of an answer there, I think, lies in early education, but also in how we think about cyber infrastructure and use it to bring more researchers into using cyber infrastructure. You mentioned software and computing in particular, but what we heard overwhelmingly that makes a lot of sense to me is that interest in research for a lot of people, and especially groups that have been underrepresented, starts at data and problems that people care about solving, and therefore need data in order to solve those problems. I know, in the physical sciences, and OSG has significant history here, there's a significant focus on simulation, and a lot of our computing investments have been focused on producing data through simulation. But underrepresented research domains and underrepresented individuals, we heard from some people doing high school work, particularly underrepresented minorities and women, care much more about the problems they can solve with data than they do about learning a new programming language or learning HPC or learning some advanced technique for its own sake.
So we have one more question, and we are almost out of time. The question is from Eva Dielman. What can individual CI professionals do to help with the effort of reaching out and including the missing millions?
So I think it's a great question. And I would start with the organizations and institutions that you're part of. So the geophysicists recently did a Black Lives Matter town hall. AGU in the geosciences has done a series of public forums. There's work to be done. We use the phrase pathways, not pipelines, because pipelines convey the notion that you can't, have variation in choices. But the idea is, for OSG, for other consortia and groups that you're part of, to basically ask the question, who's here, who's not here, and how do we be broader and more inclusive?
And I'd pick up on that and say it's also about community building. One of the issues here is how do you begin to intellectually engage with other people in a meaningful way? And that's not just a hello, let's collaborate. It really says, let's get serious about working together. And I think that's the other part of this is how can you begin to say, I want to work with you as a colleague, not just a senior personnel, if you will, but to figure out a way to intellectually engage with people in a meaningful way, I think is important to help build a community.
Yeah. And if I could piggyback on that, when MSCC, the Minority Serving Cyber Infrastructure Consortium, began working with Internet2, they said, before we start forming a partnership, help us, Internet2, to understand the depth of your commitment. And immediately they looked at the board, the governing board for Internet2, which was mostly white male and R1s. And to its credit, Internet2 has now broadened its board to be more representative of a diverse set of institutions and diverse populations. I think, Lauren, you get the last word.
Ditto all around. And I would really like to emphasize that this report is definitely not the end, right? And certainly there will be a time years out to really evaluate what NSF, what the US has done, not just as a result of this report, but in truly addressing the problem with the missing millions. And it really does require a whole bunch of people to come together, which makes it sound like a really big problem, but there are concrete steps that we can take. And for those of us in cyber infrastructure, steps within our own work to make a big difference.